So yeah, I've been on Twitter all morning, and while I certainly noticed that Bendis was trending, I had no idea that was in reference to Brian Michael Bendis, comic book writer extraordinaire and Marvel architect who apparently DC Comics has just hired away. And I believe is going to be their new Geoff Johns, because Geoff Johns, of course, is now busy with the DCEU. And I think that's actually a very good approximation in terms of talent, for both good and bad, and we'll get to that. But first off, I'd like to point out that I probably still wouldn't have made the connection if one of you hadn't tweeted me the article, thankfully, the article itself with the news story, and said, "Grace, what do you think of this?" And I was like, wait a minute, Bendis? Bendis? Oh my God. And I think the reason that I never personally made the connection is because comic book industry news never makes it to the national stage, to the mainstream stage. And it's quite sad because while the characters, of course, are talked about quite a bit, the people who have created the characters and have, continued with their legacy and told so many of the stories that are being, to some degree bastardized on the small and big screen today, well, I think maybe that's too strong a word, but very little regard for the source material, if we're going to be honest, right? I mean, that's not mean, it's just honest. And nobody cares about that talent. So to see it trend on Twitter, is totally unexpected. And I think it's actually quite fitting that the editors at Twitter itself haven't bothered to look into why Bendis is trending. In an effort not to go out of business, Twitter has decided to lean in heavily when it comes to editorialization. So if something's trending for a while, they'll look into it and then they'll put like a one-sentence summary as to why it's trending to pique your interest, to make Twitter work a little bit better. But nobody over there apparently cares as to why Bendis is trending. And it's a big story. Now, as I said, he's one of the few comic book writers that's left today that's a name in the biz. That's because he's been around for a really long time. And it's interesting, a lot of the big names that are contemporaries of Brian Michael Bendis, they kind of went away. Either they went to different mediums or they went to like Image, right? Brian K. Vaughan. Who knows what Grant Morrison's doing right now, right? But I think a lot of people were disillusioned with what the comic book business has become in the wake of its Hollywood success. Because there are a lot more mandates from editorial, although we're seeing, talented within Hollywood's like, welcome to the party, the suits tell us what to do. You saw that Wall Street Journal coverage of Justice League this morning with Kevin Tsujihara insisting on, a under 2-hour running length. But anyway, more mandates from editorial, and then movies and TV taking the lead when it comes to shaping the future of these characters and where they're headed. And there's, from my own experiences and from people I've talked to, there are just endless rewrites with no point. It sometimes seems like you're being asked to do rewrites because they don't know what the next story is or what exactly they want out of it, and very little communication between different lines of books. So you have people who are in charge who don't know what the left hand is doing, even when they're in charge of the right, as a metaphor. But anyway, Brian Michael Bendis comes from a time when the comic book industry had all its ducks in a row, and they were doing a fabulous job, and they were firing on all cylinders. And he was one of the main cylinders. In fact, he ultimately became a Marvel architect, and that's how many of you might be familiar with his name. In the beginning of all this, the Hollywood explosion when it comes to Marvel properties, before Kevin Feige said, "Forget it, I'm in charge, and I want nothing to do with the rest of the company." But they had a group of writers, and I believe they might have thrown an artist in there or two. And they were called the Marvel Architects, and that was their job to come up with the blueprint at large. It was basically like a writer's room, because that's what you have for episodic content, be it comic books or television or something like the MCU, which even though it's movies has become episodic. And they would get a nice little credit at the end of the movies, although I don't know how much they actually contributed. But anyway, that was like the high point of Brian Michael Bendis' Marvel career. Now, where it started was he started out as an indie comic book writer, and he was hired in because he's very good at natural dialogue, particularly like teen dialogue or casual dialogue is maybe even a better way to explain it. So they brought him in to do Ultimate Spider-Man. Interestingly, when Marvel was trying to capitalize on the success of X-Men and Spider-Man, they were like, that was their new 52. They were like, is it too hard for you to jump into Marvel 616? That's like the main comics. Why don't you jump into the Ultimate line? And Mark Millar came in around that time too. He actually did come in at that time with his version of the Avengers, the Ultimates, his X-Men. But really even though some good ideas from Mark Millar came about then, Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury, only Ultimate Spider-Man, Bendis' Ultimate Spider-Man, stood the test of time and was, an ongoing for like over a decade. And it eventually swung into the Miles Morales storyline. Brian Michael Bendis created Miles Morales. And Ultimate Spider-Man, by the way, has been very lucrative for Marvel. It's become an animated series, and it was the basis, including the Miles stuff, unfortunately, for Spider-Man Homecoming, the latest Spider-Man movie. But Brian Michael Bendis didn't stop there. He also was the driving force behind Jessica Jones, who of course became a very popular Netflix character. He was the guy behind Secret Invasion, which is coming up in the MCU, as we can see the hints already from that 1990s Captain Marvel movie they've announced. And then he, I think the last good thing he really did was he redid the X-Men. They were having some problems after Grant Morrison left with his new X-Men. Then Brian Michael Bendis came in. He made them interesting, I think, but he was playing a very short game. I mean, none of his ideas have really played out. He was the one who brought back, had the X, because, they killed off Scott Summers, and Jean Grey is dead, so, let's bring the teenage versions from the 60s into the current timeline. And I think that was fun. Again, it was a short game versus a long game. So I have to say, I don't think that Brian Michael Bendis is, considering he was a Marvel architect, I think that's actually his worst skill. I think he's very good, again, at writing natural dialogue. That's his strong point. But sometimes it's also his weakness, because I've read many a Brian Michael Bendis comic where I'll turn the page and I feel like I'm looking at a book. It's just wall-to-wall, dialogue balloons. And it's very frustrating. It's like, this is a visual medium, Brian Michael Bendis, get it together. I'd also say that his work has a sameness to it. The man has zero range. For instance, I'll never forgive him for what he did to Emma Frost, a character that Grant Morrison made glorious. I mean, Brian Michael Bendis just couldn't write her. And so he has no range. And so I get a little nervous about that because I don't think he's a good fit with, part of the DC that I like. I'm getting ahead of myself. But also, he really hasn't done anything new at Marvel for quite some time. And he's been there for 18 years. I think the last thing that he did, which a lot of people weren't happy about, was that he was behind making Iceman come out as gay. The junior version that traveled through time, and then, of course, it rippled through to the older version who was like, oh, yeah. And a lot of people had a problem with that. And some people don't like Miles Morales. And I think that, you saw that, I think most recently, rear its ugly head at New York Comic Con, where rumor is it that behind closed doors, all the comic book stores were complaining to Marvel saying, nobody's buying this stuff. I'm sure you're well-intentioned and diversity is great and all, but bottom line, we still have to sell comic books, and what you're giving us, nobody wants to buy. I would imagine that Brian Michael Bendis, I think Marvel, this is a tiny bit embarrassing to them, but I don't think they're terribly sad to see him go. I think they've squeezed all the creative juice out of Brian Michael Bendis, and maybe DC will replenish him. Maybe they won't. We'll see. Now, in terms of actual caliber of talent, he's not an idea man like Mark Miller, who's, Netflix just recently hired him because he's just so good at big picture ideas. But I also don't think that, Brian Michael Bendis has the story structure talent that someone like Brian K. Vaughan does. I don't think he's a particularly disciplined or epic storyteller. Again, it's all about that natural dialogue. I think that's why Spider-Man was a good fit for him, and why I think the Defenders are a very good fit for him. Although if you read the Defenders comic book, a lot of the characters sound exactly the same. It's a little frustrating. So as I said, what's he going to do at DC? I think he's going to take over for Geoff Johns. And he and Geoff Johns are actually a very good comparison in terms of talent. They have very similar qualities that they bring to the table. I would bet, including the belief that they are great architects and they can do great crossover events. Although the last great crossover event that they had at DC was Geoff Johns's, and that's Blackest Night. And I love Geoff Johns's Batman Earth 1. I just think he's hit or miss. I mean, he's now very busy with the DCEU, so somebody else has to come in here and I think really take over. You'd think it would be the editors, but maybe Brian Michael Bendis will have somewhat of an editorial position as well at DC. I mean, Geoff Johns was making these kinds of decisions. I think he was like chief creative officer at that point. And maybe that's the role that Brian Michael Bendis will sign on, because he could still, of course, write comics at the same time, just as Johns did. Now, I think that just like Geoff Johns, Brian Michael Bendis is a great fit voice-wise with all of the DC characters except for the Trinity, and also darker characters like Suicide Squad. Maybe he could write Suicide Squad because, again, good at natural dialogue and like a casualness, which I think would be very much the case was the Suicide Squad book. But all the characters, again, are going to sound exactly the same. He can't write. I have zero faith that he can write Batman, Superman, or Wonder Woman. But Green Lantern, which of course was Geoff Johns' strength, I think he'd do a great Green Lantern. I think he'd do a great Flash. They all sound like all of his other characters, but I think he'd do a fabulous idea. So perhaps, and for me, that's not the part of DC that I'm a big fan of. It's less exciting for me, but I think that if you're into that part of DC, this could be really promising. And I also think he's there again to orchestrate crossover events. But I think there's an overdependence on crossover events right now, particularly at DC. Like they have the New 52, Rebirth, the upcoming situation with Watchmen, also spearheaded by Johns, by the way. I think that's going to blow up in their faces. I think that it's important to have really strong solo stories so that when you do have a crossover, that's why it's a big deal. Not that they're together all the time, so okay, who cares if it's a little extra special this month. Most comic book titles come out on a monthly basis, sometimes twice a month, but that's rare. So again, I don't think that Brian Michael Bendis' voice fits DC, at least the Trinity, which I think is obviously the flagship titles, or should be the flagship titles of the publisher. But who knows what the voice of DC is these days, page or screen. That's something they're really trying to figure out. They messed with it, which I never understood why, and now they can't really, get it back. But I have to say, Brian Michael Bendis certainly does have a very strong voice, and he does have architectural experience. So let's see what he comes up with. I'd certainly be interested in it. But again, I hope he doesn't play a short game in terms of a long game as he did with the X-Men, because that just ended up not really being able to go anywhere, and it was a baton that no one else could take. Those X-Men titles are all now actually unreadable. By the way, on a side note, if they're looking for DC talent up over there, I would take Sean Murphy, whose Batman White Knight is sensational, very heavily inspired by Batman the Animated Series, and put him on the regular Batman titles. Best Batman I've read in a long time, and I really strongly recommend that you check it out. I'm glad that DC Comics recognizes that they have a problem, or maybe they don't. It might be at the end of the day, Geoff Johns is like, I'm too busy to be involved with the comics anymore. And Brian Michael Bendis, and I think this is totally true, is a great Geoff Johns 2.0. Well, now he's not a better version, but the next version. All right, so what do you think of this news? Do you think Marvel should feel bad? Do you think DC got a deal? And also, what do you think of the state of the comic book industry today in light of having to live in the shadow of Hollywood? All right, write your thoughts down below, and you can check out some more videos right now.